Welcome to Strange Stories with the Seeker and the Skeptic. Today we are speaking with Dash Kwiatkowski. Dash is a freelance writer and paranormal investigator. They're currently self-producing a paranormal investigation show about the connection between queerness, transness, and the paranormal. Welcome to the show, Dash. We are very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Absolutely. So I always am interested in how people got into doing paranormal investigations. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I've been a fan of spooky stories and ghost shows and all that for basically my entire life. And I've always just sort of I think it's the way that a lot of them are sort of presented in terms of television. There's always this sort of, it feels daunting. There's this distance. You see all these like people, mostly white guys in cargo shorts, will have their own van and they have their own t-shirts that are branded and they have all this expensive gear. And then you go and you Google like what's the best EVP recorder, and everyone's like, it's this one that's over $500. And I just feel like there's a lot of sort of there is a lot of sort of expensive buy-in in terms of how it is presented. And so I always sort of had that distance where I was like, I will enjoy it from afar. And then once the pandemic started, so in sort of early 2020, I was sort of making my exit from the career of stand-up comedy. It felt in the early months of the pandemic like stand-up comedy was sort of a little harder to do also,
Mm-hmm.
all things considered. But I'd already been sort of burning out on it. And I think I was looking around at, we're facing a climate apocalypse and we're facing the rise of fascism globally. And I think I had this moment where I was like, I think I just want to do things that make me happy. And I think I just want to figure out how to do things that I actually want to do because now, why not now? Why not actually try something? And so I started looking into some of the gear that I could afford. I started looking into what was sort of accessible to me. And I talked to a friend of mine who we run a sort of a tongue-in-cheek psychic advice podcast together. I think when we started it, neither of us were really thinking about specific experiences we had had, and we were just sort of like, oh, it'll be kind of funny, we'll just we'll answer questions from psychic advice Facebook. And then the longer it's gone, at some point Rosa was like, oh, I have psychic dreams sometimes, and I was like, oh, okay, for sure. And I've been sort of thinking about my own like intuitive stuff, and so it has sort of become more earnest as time has gone on, which is a funny little trajectory. But I hit up Rosa and I was like, hey, let's like, do you want to actually maybe start doing paranormal investigation stuff? And so we started very simple, just like, going into the woods, going to like there's a cool abandoned military base near me that's been sort of like really overtaken by nature. And so just started going out and practicing techniques and practicing some of the methodology. And I really, really liked it. And it was immediately very sort of responsive when we would get out there and do it. And I was like, okay, I think I can actually maybe do this sort of for real and in earnest. And so I talked to Rosa about like, hey, do how would you feel about sort of let's make, shooting like a show where we actually document ourselves doing this. And yeah, that is where it all started.
That's awesome. I love that you took it as the approach of like, I want to do what makes me happy. I feel
Yeah.
like that's where Jonathan and I are at in our lives as well. Just like, I don't want to work for the man. You know, I just want to pursue the things that are, that light me up. And that's what it sounds like. Like this field really lights you up, which is awesome.
It's just we have such little time as a in this form, at least in this sort of physical in this sort of squishy physical form, we have such little time. And I think that there's no reason not to be at least trying to do things that bring you joy. And for me right now, that's doing this paranormal stuff and then organizing for Palestine. Those are sort of the only two things that I do with my life. And it is stressful for sure, but I
Hmm.
also feel a lot better than any point when I've been, spending my time sitting at a desk for a day job that, makes me want to pour bleach into my eyes or whatever.
Yeah, I spent a decade working for hospital companies, so I definitely know that feeling very,
Oh
very
yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Glad to be out of that. So, as you started to get things together for this stuff, is there anything through the process of and just want to just front load this? I really enjoyed the first episode of this. That it
Thank
Me
you
was
so
too.
much.
That's
everything I
awesome.
was hoping was going to be. Your guys' production value is stellar.
Thank you.
The pacing is good. Some of the people you found to talk to as guests, I think highlight uh, some types of personalities that you don't get to see in this realm. And I feel like that's probably what you're going for. I feel like you nailed that.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Is there anything as you were putting this first installment together,
Yeah.
is there anything that really like surprised you about about the people, about like working with folks?
So I think it's not that I mean, so you've seen the episode. I've obviously the biggest surprise was the series of synchronicities from the second day. That was a huge surprise. But I think the thing that, and this wasn't a surprise because I had anticipated a lot of varied experiences, a lot of sort of different experiences. But I think the thing that sort of really sort of felt, it brought me a lot of joy, and it sort of made me feel like, okay, like this is where actually this feels like a good thing, is just how wildly different any single person you talk to approaches magic, approaches practice, approaches how they want to be participating in something that is, I mean, one of the secret goals. So the thesis, obviously, of the show is that queerness and transness are sort of intrinsically connected to the strange and the magical and the paranormal. But the secret thesis of the show is to let people on the coasts know that there are queer and trans people and people of color in the rural South who are living and thriving, and just really sort of, to really highlight the fact that as much as these areas get written off sort of very easily by people on the coast, and I used to be that. I'm from San Francisco. My understanding of the South was very just based on stereotypes of the South, and what people tell you, and like, oh, it's everyone down there is a certain way. And, I'm not saying that there's no bigotry in the South, but like I've also been called slurs on the streets in New York City plenty, and I think, you really think about like how much to maintain sort of a hard red voting block, gerrymandering has to happen, and districts are cut up in a way. But specifically looking at people who exist as part of a marginalized gender identity or racial identity, who are also choosing to participate in magic, which in a place that is sort of oftentimes more Christian, oftentimes more based in sort of like fundamentalist religion, is choosing to participate in another sort of form of marginalization in terms of being a magic practitioner, or in whatever degree, and just looking at both the sort of the commitment to that, and how varied that practice can be, was really heartening. And just sort of, even if you see it coming, it still is sort of, it's hard to, you can sort of conceptually understand that it's going to be a certain way, but then when you experience it, it still sort of is, it feels so big, and it feels just very, very important to me.
I agree. I think it is really important. And like, you said and Jonathan said, you're giving a voice to people who don't typically have a voice. They don't have a platform to share their experiences. And I think you're right in terms of, you know, queer people, trans people, they exist all throughout the country. It's not just, the north or the east or
Yeah.
the coast, like you said. Like, I think that is really important to just showcase that. And I think you did that really well.
Thank you.
I'm curious of what you think. You said there are some connections between queerness and
Yes.
transness and the paranormal. So
Yeah.
what are those connections and why do you believe those exist?
So I think that there's a few levels of answers. And the first answer is obviously, othering, and feeling sort of kinship and sympathy with other sort of things that have been othered, sort of treated as villainous, sort of intrinsically. And I think there's sort of on the surface level, there's a very obvious connection between, go back and watch Lion King and watch the way Scar's eyebrows are animated, right? And that's like, this is a queer coded character. Look at Ursula. Look at like what we are told from like at a very deep cultural level is villainous, and queerness is coded as villainous sort of pretty consistently. Even now, I remember I watched Fast X, the Fast and Furious movie, and everyone was like, wow, Jason Momoa really like brings this really crazy energy, and he just plays it kind of gay. And I was like, oh, that's okay for sure. We're still doing this. Don't get me wrong. I love the Fast movies. They're not very good. They drive a car into space. Delightful. um but I, the sort of the coding of villainy between both queerness and also just like the unknown, and ghosts are, you're supposed to have a bad time, you're supposed to be scared. If you run into something that is seemingly inhuman in the woods, you're supposed to run away, you're supposed to be scared, you're supposed to be frightened. This is supposed to be a bad experience. And so on the very surface level, I think there's a lot of being othered and sort of coded as villainous. But I do think there's more to it than that as well. And I talk a little bit in the pilot about some of the pre-colonial societies around the world, and I think it's very easy to be like, oh, look at this other culture that I'm not a part of, and I try not to do that too much. I try not to base the entire argument, but I sort of just conceptually the fact that across the world there have been multiple cultures where genders outside of the binary have both been accepted and also just sort of intrinsically considered spiritual or magical or sort of connected to something otherworldly. There is a book that I cannot stop recommending called Transgender Warriors by Leslie Feinberg, who wrote Stone Butch Blues and is like a real sort of classic historian and activist. But in Transgender Warriors, Feinberg talks a lot about some of this historical, and Feinberg is not talking about the paranormal, but is talking about sort of what we might today call trans people, from throughout history. And one of the things that comes up a lot is the sort of the magic element of it. So when you look at, say, Joan of Arc sitting under what Joan called a fairy tree, hearing voices that told Joan what to do, right? And then, Joan of Arc is a very obvious, a lot of trans people really resonate with the story, the idea of dressing and living in a gender presentation that is not your own. When you look at, there was a group of I'm gonna get this anecdote wrong because I haven't picked the book up in a second. But just a group of sort of like anarchist, activist men who would dress in, fairy outfits, and these were queer men, and they were called fairies, right? And then you look at, in general, like the fact that fairy exists as, I mean, it's used less often now, but as a slur for gay men, and also, the connection to the fae and the magical and all these things. And so I think that I don't have a specific answer in terms of like, oh, here's the actual connection. But I do have this sort of, and I think this is the thing for me, is I feel very idiosyncratically connected to magic and the strange and things like that. And I think the more people that I talk to who are also queer and trans and exist in this space, who have that same sort of like internal deep connection, the more confirmed I am in this sort of this thesis or this hypothesis that there is this connection. And I think part of what I want to do with the rest of the show is see if I can uncover more so what that link is, outside of just this idea that like we are connected through liminality, through identity that is in flux, through an identity that is not sort of accepted mainstream wise, to something else that is sort of constantly in flux, or by definition in flux, at least.
I am always appreciative of people bringing up the cultures of basically, there's not an easy way to say that the cultures that Europeans decimated through time. Yeah. Because the average person probably doesn't have the knowledge of that maybe you or I have. I've studied a lot of that stuff myself. Yeah. And especially like 20 years ago when I was in my early 20s, noticing that it really is only, people coming from the Abrahamic religions that
Yeah.
really have this. It's almost like a hard on for the gender binary.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really exist in very many other cultures. Almost everybody else has a way to deal with people humanely,
Yeah.
except for, basically Christians.
Yeah.
And and the Islam issue as well. That's also a problem within, uh, the conservative Islam communities. And I try to make that definition, because I have known people who are part of that religion who don't, who aren't, Sharia people. You know what I'm saying? Like there are people who follow that faith that aren't Iran.
I think in general, when I think about faith, faith is tricky. I love the teaching of Islam. I love a lot of the teachings of Christ when you get into the things that are sort of quoted as being said. And I think it's very easy to sort of to think. So even just, looking at Christianity, right? Looking at Christianity, I think it's very easy to say it's a certain way because in practice it has been, right? And in practice, and it's hard because we get into this point where, like, where does the distinction matter between what something sort of is in the text as it is written versus something as that has been used as a tool for sort of the maintenance of power and the maintaining of power. And I think that you get this in any fundamentalist religion. With Islam, it's interesting to me because I see it's very hard, especially in this country, when so much of what we've understood Islam to be has been just in post 9/11 propaganda to sort of manufacture consent in terms of invading Iraq and invading Afghanistan and all of these things. But I think this is you sort of it's easier to learn this sort of for me, or has been easier to learn this for me sort of as I've been sort of digging deeper into Palestine activism, but just understanding that, queer people, trans people, I think there's this fear mongering sort of thing that happens, and we get a lot of pink washing with this as well. But I think, even reading, there's a website actually called Queering the Map. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Queering the Map is great, and right now they're featuring a lot of people from Gaza, and it is queer people in different parts of the country making posts about queerness and the queer experience. And the thing that sort of is consistent to me is this idea that, like, queer people are existing and thriving everywhere. And the threat to queer people, at least in Palestine right now, is not Islam. It is bombs. It's bombs being paid
Sure.
for by the American people with our tax dollars. It's bombs being
Mhm.
paid for by British people. And I think it's very ezy to be like, oh, this religion doesn't like queer people, but in the text of it, a lot of religions specifically have some moment or some whatever. But even that, it's not even just in the text, it's in the practice of people who are trying to maintain religion for power. So
Right.
as a person who spends a lot of time with Muslim friends, I don't think that there is anything inherently anti-queer about Islam. And in fact, I've experienced a lot more sort of welcoming and kindness from Muslims than I have from the most Christians that I know.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
I definitely my experience has mostly been with Christians, and it's been mostly been negative, to be really honest
totally,
with you.
totally,
I'm one of those people that escaped evangelicalism,
absolutely, absolutely.
from being a young person, and
Yeah,
just the freedom of, in my 20s, the freedom of walking away from
yeah,
those teachings changed everything about my life. You know, and so I try to speak more in the context of that, because it's the context that I've lived.
totally, totally.
And I try to show that I'm open to people who are in other places being different than what is depicted to us. And
Absolutely.
I'm not going to pretend that I always am able to emote that properly, because
Totally.
words are hard. Um, I also have tried to be as apolitical as I can without
Sure.
lying about who I am.
Totally.
But I've spent, I'm 43, and I've spent my entire adult life trying to explain to Christians
Yeah.
how the Israeli state has been
Yeah.
created and propped up by the U.S. and British
Yep.
governments the entire time it has
Yeah.
existed. They
Absolutely.
displaced an indigenous people and have
Hmm.
helped to continue to displace an indigenous people
Yeah.
for twice as long as I've been alive.
Yeah.
And we completely ignored that. And this, I'm with you on the frustration of right
Yeah.
now with the people that are experiencing what they're experiencing. And so, you can
Well,
only
and
be
it's
quiet for so long about
yeah.
stuff,
Well, and especially given that, prior to the founding of uh prior to the founding of the state, that region did have Jewish people and Muslims and Christians living in harmony. And, there's going to be conflict anywhere in the world,
Mhm.
just sort of in general, but it was a really multicultural, multi-religious place. And it's just, I think the more people look into it, the better. I will, and we can jump back into fun spooky magic stuff. But I think it's, we are at a point right now where I think more and more people in the world are starting to understand the plight of the Palestinian people and what they've been going through. And I just, I hope that we are nearing our sort of our end of apartheid South Africa moment. I want that very much. That is what I'm organizing for with people here where I live. And yeah, I think we have to, and this gets into sort of my philosophy in general. This gets into sort of how I approach magic and how I approach the art that I make and everything. But we have to proceed as if we are capable of making changes and making things better than how we found them. That feels very, very important to me. And I think a lot of us sort of get this idea that we're supposed to do it on our own. I do not think that is possible. I think that we are a communal species. I think the only reason humans have survived as long as we have as a species is by existing in communities and propping each other up and taking care of each other. And I think capitalism has really sort of pushed us into a more sort of individualist thing that is not good for us and is not helpful for ourselves or the planet or the other amazing creatures that we are driving to extinction with climate change and so on. But I have to believe that we can participate and create a better existence for everybody and for all of us and for the world. And I try to sort of proceed. I try to exist with that in mind.
Yeah, I mean it seems like the work that you're doing is propelling that, it's
Thank you.
it's like again, it's allowing people to have a voice and it's advocating for what you believe is right. So I think that is very important and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much.
You mentioned a little while ago, and you also mentioned it in your episode about just liminal spaces,
Yeah,
liminal identities, and the connection with paranormal. So, can you explain maybe to some of our listeners who aren't really sure, like what liminal means, like explain
definitely.
what that means and kind of the connections there?
So liminality as a concept, and it's actually sort of become sort of fun and trendy with, like, I know the teens on TikTok are making all their like back rooms, liminals, like all these like CGI like the spaces that look like, back rooms in a hotel or like a convention hall. It's sort of become a trendy. I was actually worried about putting the episode out because we settled on this name, and I was like, oh no, are we gonna get our search engine optimization is gonna be terrible? But liminality sort of refers to things that are in flux, things that are sort of temporary or sort of in flux between states and flux between places. Bridges, there's a reason a lot of sort of bridges feel very spooky. A lot of bridges are sort of, people believe bridges to be haunted. Train stations, schools, there's a lot of haunted prisons. I mean, the energy in a prison based on, the prison industrial system is bad also, but anything that is sort of in flux or temporary, right? Hotels are sort of considered haunted a lot. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? There's so much different energy in and out, people coming and leaving and going, and sort of this idea of something being in flux is sort of the sort of the what at least we think about paranormal in terms of liminal spaces. And there's a lot of theories about that. There's definitely people who will say, like, if you look at a border or a bridge, if everybody is sort of thinking about this space or this passageway as a doorway to something else, whether it is another city or another state or another part, the sort of the energy and the thought sort of, you know, however much you believe in manifestation, however much you believe in the power of consciousness sort of affecting things outside of ourselves, there is the belief that it can be, you know, just based on perception. If everyone thinks of something as a doorway or a bridge to another space, then it can be in multiple different ways. But it is sort of a there's been a decent amount of thought in terms of liminality being sort of very connected to hauntings. And so when I was thinking about, you know, gender identity and the idea of being trans, the idea of being told you are one thing for as long as you can remember, and then at some point realizing like I actually don't think that I have to be this thing. I don't have to be this thing that I have been sort of told I am, and taking the steps to exist in a different way. I don't think it's just non-binary trans people. I don't think, you know, the idea of like genders outside the binary, even binary trans people who are transitioning from one gender to another, there's liminality in that journey. I've met so many, I have so many of my friends who are binary trans people find as they transition the way that they want to exist in the gender that they actually are. The way that they want to exist is often going to be different than what culturally we're told that gender is supposed to look like. I've met so many trans masculine people who, as soon as they are more comfortable and they've socially transitioned and they've physically transitioned, then they're like, all right, I'm actually gonna try some different like fun makeup or skirt or dress combinations that maybe they wouldn't have felt comfortable in prior to transitioning because it would sort of feel dysphoric. But now that they have transitioned, they can say, all right, well, I can exist in this gender sort of however I want. And so even in that, I think there can be sort of a very liminal sort of version of even a binary gender. Um, and so I think the more that I sort of heard, the more that I understood how sort of the hauntings or everything are sort of fixated on these spaces that are liminal. I was also thinking about like hauntings, I think, fixate on people as well. I think hauntings or energy or magic can get really attached to people. And I've, even from personal experience, I've felt at so many moments in my life just sort of propped up or guided or sort of carried along in different directions. Even, you know, at the end of the pilot, we have our experience where we are flanked in the woods by two copperhead snakes, which was, I'll say, both very scary and a relief that it was good TV. Because here's my thing, right? I love a ghost show in general. I'm very opposed to for the things that I make. Like I'm not hiding someone in a room to slam a door,
Yeah.
right? Because that's just, and I get it, it's fun. I like to watch these things too, but it's not what I'm trying to make. You know, I think we're aiming a lot more for documentary than say reality TV.
Yeah.
And there is something nerve-wracking about going to another state with you know, a camera and a bunch of people and being like, I really hope something spooky happens, because if it doesn't, we are wasting a lot of time in this moment. And I think being flanked in the woods by two copperhead snakes was both very scary and also very cool, because you know, you can, on a ghost show, you can be like, oh, we there was a ghost here and so we had to leave. And there's going to be a certain amount of people who are like, well, I don't believe in ghosts, but everybody does believe in snakes.
Right.
And I think that there is something very, very nice about being like, all right, well, this was scary, but at least it was good television.
Yeah,
Oh, but to the point of that, sorry, to the point of that, the way when I think about the snakes showing up, when I think about the snakes sort of, because I didn't feel the energy of it did not feel malicious to me. I did not feel like it was a threat, like we are going to harm you, but it did feel like a very guiding force, like a very like,
Yeah.
hey, this is not the space for you right now. Maybe whether or not we are not ready to have the experience that we were trying to have, or whether or not there was just something else in the woods that was maybe more of a threat or dangerous to us. It felt like a very sort of like, you know, when you see like a kid reaching for a hot stove and you're like, oh, hey, don't do that. Like, this is not what you're supposed to be doing right now. That was the energy that it sort of, it really felt to me, was just like a very kind guiding force. And when I look back and I think about the course of my life, I feel like I've always sort of had that. I feel like I've always sort of had something outside of myself, just sort of making sure that I at least stay afloat.
I grew up in rural North Carolina,
Yeah.
and when the camera went, and I was like, that is a copperhead snake,
Yeah.
and they need to go away now because
Uh-huh.
growing up in that kind of that kind of area like that, you learn real fast. Like there's things that you just
Yeah.
it's time to go in the other direction. So
Yep.
I'm glad no one was harmed in that scene. It was a little stressful.
I was
Uh,
very stressed. I was definitely stressed out, especially, when there's two of them. And
Mhm.
copperheads will not, there aren't a ton of fatalities with copperhead snakes now, but it'll mess you up pretty bad. But it's fatality if if you can't get to a hospital quick enough. And I think we
Right.
were 45 minutes away from the nearest hospital when that happened. And the fact that there were two of them and the fact that they were not scared of a large group of people with flashlights and stuff was definitely really off-put because I say this in the pilot, but I'm a big fan of animals. I'm a big fan of wildlife. I love a lot of creatures. I'm a big fan of, I think with the exception of mosquitoes, I'm a big fan of the vast majority of creatures you'll find in the wild. And I really love snakes. I really like reptiles in general. And I'm so used to you go on a hike and if there's even just one person usually is enough to send a snake the other direction because like
mhm.
they're not trying to mess with us. They don't want to have anything to do with us. They're trying to eat little rodents and bugs and stuff. Like they're just doing snake stuff. And so the fact that these two snakes just would not leave and we're
Mhm.
just sort of inching closer and closer and closer to Fox. It was tremendously stressful for me, both as a person who cares about Fox and a person who's like, this
Yeah.
whole thing could go very bad. And that feels like it's on me a little bit.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about like the investigation, the pilot episode, kind of what you guys did there.
Yeah, so we really wanted to start with the grounding. We really wanted to start with just sort of experiencing the lore first. And so, we talked to Tim Henson, which is it's very we kept a lot of Kermit jokes, I will say. We talked to Tim Henson to just get some of the lore, and he shared a lot with us. He let us in the space, he let us in the museum, he let us in. They had some of the cabins. This didn't make the episode, but they had some of the cabins that are from the original, like the original story. The cabins that some of the people were living in, they've been moved to this area. There is another area. There's like a cave that is part of the lore, but Tim was very eager to show us this, and we were not able to get in touch with the folks who ran the cave, so we're like, all right, we don't have to get into that zone. Also, like it felt cooler to sort of be in the cabins and experience some of the actual stuff, like having read the book written at the time to be able to say like, oh, this is that cabin that they're talking about. This is the false teeth that show up in the in the pilot. Um, and so we really wanted to start in that space. And I think the thing that became very apparent to us was it just did not feel, if our goal is to highlight voices that have not been highlighted, as we were doing it, it just sort of felt like this is a very Bell family space. This is a very like the people who wrote the stories down. I mean, Andrew Jackson is in the lore, and sort of nobody when you read the story, at no point is like also this guy was a terrible genocide man. Like this
Hmm.
was a horrible racist. It's all like, oh yeah, the president was here, and it's sort of told from a very specific way. And I think as we got into that, I there was a moment where I was just like, I don't want to be just sort of recreating the investigation that anyone would have done and has done a bunch of times, where you just go and you do some ghost stuff in the space and you have your spooky experience. And it definitely was spooky. There's other stuff that didn't make the pilot. Like I kept getting poked. I kept getting poked in the ribs when no one was standing near me, which was a little bit unnerving. There's no real good way to on TV be like, also I keep getting poked, it's not as did not feel as relevant for the actual thing, but that kept happening. But the thing that sort of really got my attention as we were shooting, like at every moment between shooting our investigation stuff, the wildlife was really really engaging with us in a way. So like Rosa stepped outside to take a phone call, and a huge owl just lands on one of the trees and just makes eye contact with her for
Oh.
the entire time that she's outside. And she came back in and she's like, you guys aren't gonna believe this. A giant owl just sat on a tree and stared at me for a really long time. And then this kept happening where like, you know, there would be like a really large praying mantis and it would just like look, it would just come up and just look. And praying mantises are very cool because they're like an extremely like sight-based hunter. So you can really tell when they're checking you out, like when they're staring at you. It's a very cool animal. But this kept happening where all of these things in nature kept sort of getting our attention, it felt like. And so I think as we were thinking about that, as we were thinking about that first night of investigation, it was really this like, hey, we got to get outside of a building. We got to get outside of the narrative as it exists, as it has been told, as any number of television episodes of different shows have been about, you know, this dangerous ghost and there's all these terrible things that happened to this poor guy. And it's like, for sure, the poor guy also was a slave owner and was all of these things. And even like the woman who gets blamed for a lot of it, Kate Batts, they're like, oh, Kate Batts was involved. Kate Batts was a large muscular woman with a very sick husband, so she had to basically do all of the stuff that a guy would traditionally do at that time because her husband was ill. And that community hated her. And it's like, of course they did. That's sort of how, you know, this idea of gender roles and what people are supposed to do. And so when you think about like, oh, why is this the person who's catching all the flack for whatever haunted thing is happening, for whatever sort of spooky thing is happening? There's so much there in terms of who tells the story and who gets blamed for things and who gets sort of painted in a certain light. And I think in that first night, we're like, all right, it really just feels sort of like we're not retreading, but I could see a path ahead of us that just retreads a lot of investigations that have been done. And so we wanted to get out into nature. We wanted to get out and, you know, sort of wait to see what our interviews with the sort of the local queer and trans people sort of brought and what that put in front of us. And I think once we made that decision, we sort of made that switch. That's when the string of wild synchronicities happens, where our first interview hands me a jar with a flower, which is very, very sweet. I've still got it on my little altar. Obviously kept it. The flower is very dry. It just feels like a very like central part of the living room now. And then, you know, at the Botanica, we had, and this the backstory, I didn't get it into the episode, for why Rosa bought the psychic dream ointment. Rosa has psychic dreams, but they are hyper mundane. In general, Rosa will see something happen, and then a few weeks later, it'll actually happen. But it's always something like someone saying, do you have a red pencil? And someone else being like, not today, I don't. But not, so it's nothing, right? Not helpful, not a useful psychic ability, just nothing. And so I always tease Rosa because I'm like, if you practiced or something, you could maybe have a useful psychic ability, but this is nothing. Like, you have a very useless psychic ability, which is, I think, very funny to me. And so I'd been teasing Rosa, and she's like, all right, I'm going to get this psychic dream oil for understanding psychic messages. And so she buys that. And then, you know, our final interview of the day does this oracle read for us, and give the oracle card itself mentions synchronicity, which we had planned to do an explainer on and then forgot to schedule. I had a whole thing written out. Like, I wrote my thing that I was going to say about synchronicities, and I was like, I talked to the filmmaker we were working with on the pilot, and I was like, hey, I want to shoot this thing. Let's get this on the schedule to like shoot, just like, you know, me standing somewhere explaining this. And then we just forgot. Both of us forgot because a lot of stuff was happening. And so we have this interview subject who's like, hey, what's a synchronicity? Explain that to me, which is like a real tee up for this thing that I had planned to shoot. And then gives us this spell where you need a jar and messages are going to come to you in a dream. And so like all of those things happening after we make this conscious decision to sort of say like, hey, well, we don't want to tell the story as it's been told. We want to go a different direction. We want to do something that is maybe a little bit more like untread ground. I think that feels very meaningful to me, you know, and when I say in the show, but I really believe this, that synchronicities can let you know that you are going in the right direction. And it felt like a real confirmation that like, yeah, don't just do the version of this that has been done. Like do something different, do something new. And it felt like a real like affirmation that like that is the direction we should have gone.
I mean, you can definitely tell like throughout the episode that you are being led and you're just kind of, it feels more authentic to me, I think, than some other paranormal investigation shows where it's just like, this is our kind of rigid, this is what we do, this is how we investigate, you know what I mean? Like we have a protocol, and it's like, it felt more fluid, you know, which
thank you.
I think it's really cool. obviously synchronicities are very important to you, and they were
Yeah.
important in the episode. But right before we got on it, I was like, I said to Jonathan, there's some weird synchronicities with us.
Okay.
So your first episode came out on Jonathan's birthday,
Happy birthday.
Thanks.
and a year ago today,
Yeah.
we were in Tennessee,
Okay.
which is where you guys filmed
Yeah.
the first episode. And like, this is when we had like a download to do this podcast, was when we were
Wow.
on that trip in Tennessee.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. That rocks.
Yeah.
I love that. What part of Tennessee were you in?
We were in, where were we? Gatlinburg.
Yeah, right
Okay.
beside Gatlinburg on the
Cool.
Yeah.
western part of the state.
That rocks. That's
Or
so
Yeah.
cool.
That's the eastern part of the state. I can't speak today.
Wherever.
This is so, a thing, and that brings me a lot of joy, because one of the things that I've been sort of like really excited about as we were shooting it, the paranormal shows that I've watched that have felt sort of the most sort of significant to me are ones that I have had my own sort of little synchronicities with after watching. And that was sort of one of the other reasons why I sort of was inspired to be like, oh, I'm actually going to go shoot this myself. Part of that was was watching more ghost shows and having my own little synchronicities where, like, in one show I had watched, I watched Hellier. A lot of us are fans of Hellier. And so there's all this stuff with the tin can that shows up. Now, when many years before I watched Hellier, when David Bowie died, I got a little tin can tattooed on my shoulder as sort of a space oddity, like, if sitting in my tin can. I was like, this is like it's my sort of little tribute to a musician that has been very important to me. And so I'm watching this show and it's like, oh, it's tin cans. Here's this tin can thing. And I'm like, so I do have a tin can about space. Having a tin can about space feels, we're like, okay, that's kind of wild. Especially like, well, now I'm in this thing where if someone sees me and they're like, oh, Hellier, and I'm like, actually David Bowie, but kind of, right? Like,
Yeah.
kind of on accident. Yeah. So having, as I was having all these little synchronicities myself, I was like, oh, this is actually like, this is really cool and this is really inspiring, and it really gets to, I think, a really central message, I think, of all of my favorite sort of paranormal things, which is like, anyone can do this. You just got to open yourself up to it and get out there and start trying, and the phenomena will come back to you to be like, hell yeah, welcome on board, let's do some weird stuff. And so I had this moment, as the entire time we were shooting, I was like, I am just so excited for people to experience that with the show that I'm making right now, for people to experience synchronicities with this thing.
Yeah.
So this rocks. I was told there's another person who, it's another podcast person, a person that reached out, had seen the show and reached out to be like, hey, can I, do you want to come talk about it on the podcast? And in the middle of that conversation where I'm on Messenger with this person's spouse walks into the room, doesn't know about the show, does not know about me, doesn't know about this conversation, or even, again, doesn't know about the pilot, and just starts talking about the Bell Witch. And this person's like, stop, what? Crazy. And the spouse had like read a different thing that reminded them of the Bell Witch, and they came in to be like, oh, I saw this thing. Remember we were talking about this thing like years ago, whatever.
Wild.
And so this is very exciting to me. It feels it feels again very aligned that it's also two different like related to podcasts. So this is great news for me, because this is a thing that I've wanted for basically the entire time we were shooting. I was like, I can't wait for a little connection. So you two having one brings me a lot of joy, I will say.
And Hellier was our initiation point. Like,
Cool.
that
Cool.
watching that show kind of just, and Jonathan likes to say Twin Peaks at the same time, kind of just like opened us up to this world, so that's really cool.
So if you like Twin Peaks, I think you'll be very excited about the bonus episode that we're going to be premiering the first weekend of August. We were invited to Paranormal Investigate with Ray Wise from Twin Peaks. So Leland Palmer.
Oh, wow.
So we did an investigation with him. He is a delightful man. He's one of the only people, or no, he's the only person to bring his own paranormal investigation gear to the investigation, which very exciting for me. So yeah, we investigated with him in Los Angeles. It's a bonus episode because, our first season is sort of really focused on the rural American South, and also Ray Wise is a straight old man. And so it's a slightly different. Although I will say the sort of the themes do come in because we start the episode really focused on this idea of family, but we'd been considering family in terms of blood relation and like that sort of family. And then the moment when we sort of realize that and we sort of expand that to, queerness and chosen family and all that is the moment when I think sort of everything starts to click a little bit more and the investigation sort of takes flight in a different way. So, the themes of the show maintain, even if it is a bonus episode. But we did investigate with Ray Wise, and that one's coming out the first weekend of August. And we're doing a little thing in Rhode Island where I live, where we're doing a little we're debuting it at a live event where people are going to come, and then we're going to lead them in a little magic ritual. Me and Rosa are going to because I am I say this as a person with a current crowd fund going for episode 2 of Liminal. I get so uncomfortable with crowd funds just because so much of it is just like asking people for money, and I do not like asking people I know for money. But I do think that if I put on like a fun event that strangers come to, where they like do a cool thing and have a fun time, that feels like a cool fundraiser for me. That feels like much more of a fun fundraiser for me to do. So it's at a really cool little DIY space in Providence, where they have a lot of music shows and a lot of like cool different queer events. And so we are going to be working with the crowd there to sort of create and commune with some sort of guardian tulpa for the space. And so we're going to be doing that collectively as a group. And I'm very, very excited about that. So yeah, the episode's going to come out August 3rd along with that event, and everyone will be able to see a paranormal investigation that we did with Ray Wise, where he tells a ghost story that, as far as I know, he's never told in an interview before, like a experience that he had, which is very exciting. But it's also just cool to know that like he's into it. Like he's fully on board with all the spooky stuff, tulpas, egregores, all sorts of magic stuff. Like Ray is bought in, and it's really cool. He's also just like a really sweet guy. He's been, really cool and supportive of like queer and trans people for like years, for a very long time. He's just like, yeah, I cannot say enough nice things about Ray Wise. I think he's a cool guy, and he came and did our ghost show, or we came to him, but he still did our ghost show.
Yeah. That is amazing. Jonathan, I want to go.
Yeah, right. Yeah. How
Are you already sold out?
It's not sold out.
No?
It is in Providence, Rhode Island. So if you have listeners there, if you have a way there, we're gonna be premiering the thing. And then I think we're doing, as long as it gets to me in the mail in time, we're gonna be doing a silent auction with like a poster for the event that Ray will have signed. The posters just arrived to him today, so he's still got to sign them and send them back. And he is a famous person, so at his schedule, we'll see if those get to me in time. But also, there's different stuff like that we sort of, different stuff we have on the crowdfund. One of the things, oh, here it is. I'm trying to. We have a ghost hunting zine that we
cool.
do that, and that sort of gets to the thing that I was saying before about making it accessible. I wanted to, because people ask all the time, like, how can I get into ghost hunting? Do I really need all this gear? Do I really need to buy all this expensive stuff? And a lot of times it's like, no, in fact, instead of a $500 digital recorder, you can get a $12 battery powered cassette tape on eBay. And if you listen to, OG weirdos like John Tenney, when he says that like actually EVP stuff was originally conceived of using cassette tape, and there's a strong argument that your most real EVPs and sort of your most legitimate sort of EVP experiences are going to come from like the magnetic tape. And that's great because it's also considerably cheaper than a digital recorder. And so, I just wanted to write a little zine about, how to get into it and start doing it. And you can buy a spirit box, or you can buy like an old AM FM radio. And like, there's so many things you can do to just start poking around. And I think one of the things for me is obviously I would love for my show to inspire more queer and trans people to like get into the space and start doing magic stuff, but I want to inspire everyone to do it. I really would like people to, I think some of those powerful media is the stuff that lets people know like, hey, you can do this. Like you can get out there and you can do this on your own. I mean, we did the festival circuit for a while. We got a bunch of laurels. We got, the Fortean Film Fest said we were the best docuseries, or gold award for best docuseries. The ASSAP gave us an award at that festival. But then there's this point where I was like, I kind of don't want to I don't know. I watch shows get canceled on streaming. They make a whole movie about Wile E. Coyote and then just decide not to release it. And so for me, there's something about being just on YouTube, just a place anyone can
Hmm.
upload videos, to me is very much like, hey, anyone can do this. You can do
Yeah.
this and you can put it out and people can start watching it and you can sort of start participating in something bigger and magical with people you've never met just by creating and sort of jumping into that world. And so for me, it's a very like, I don't know, I want to encourage everyone to do something weird because I think it makes your life bigger and more interesting if you do.
I'm
For
definitely
sure.
with you there.
And it looks like Providence, Rhode Island is only 5 hours from us.
I mean, hey, listen, different people drive in different ways, right? When we drove down, because we drove down to Tennessee for the pilot, and I was with this is gonna Rosa's gonna be grumpy that I said this. Rosa can drive. Rosa knows how to drive.
uh,
Um and but also I would rather just drive, and something for me that was like, I think we did it in 2 or 3 days or 2 days or something. It was some long drive
mhm.
days, and then we also had to go to Memphis because Memphis, my favorite city in the country. I have people that I love very dearly in Memphis, but that was 3 hours away from, so we had to overshoot. We were going to shoot a little bit to like spend a little time in Memphis first. So it was a lot of driving, and my back does hurt sort of all the time, but it's different amount. All that to say, different amounts of driving is different for different people. So 5 hours, that is,
Oh, we love road trips.
Yeah,
that is
we are road trip people, so
We sure are. Yep. Get a good audiobook and just go. It's fun. Um, so one of the things you did during the investigation was the Estes method. Can you
Yes.
tell us about that?
I'm a huge fan of the Estes method. I talk about this in the pilot, but Connor Randall and Karl Pfiefer did it during the Spirits of Stanley. There, when they were the in-house ghost hunters at the Stanley Hotel, which is the hotel that the Overlook and The Shining is based off of. It is in Estes Park, Colorado, hence the name Estes Method.
Okay.
And one of the things that's really important to me is to cite my sources and say where something's from, because especially once people started again watching Hellier, they were like, oh, Estes Method, we're just gonna do it, and we're just gonna act like this is just like a thing that everyone does. And it's, for me, it's a similar thing. You see tarot get used in paranormal investigations all the time. We shot our show, and then after that, I learned that my friend Katie Webb, who's Egregorgonized on social media,
mhm.
is the person to really, really sort of pioneer using tarot in the paranormal investigation method, and she never really gets credited for that. And so in our Ray Wise episode, I made sure to be like, "This is, hey, Katie did this. Like, this is important. Cite your sources." Um, but the Estes method I love because I watch ghost shows, and I think anytime you see a spirit box or an EVP session where some sort of garble comes out of it and then the subtitle tells you what you're supposed to hear, so to sort of push the narrative of the show, and it's like, all right, like it could have said that, but also that's confirmation bias. You ask a question, you're expecting an answer, and you hear some fuzzy words, and it's very easy for your brain to sort of say, I think I heard the answer that I'm looking for. And so what I really love about the Estes method is by putting one person in isolation headphones and a blindfold, and just shutting them off from everything, they're only hearing the spirit box. So the spirit box for your listeners is it's a little box that just clicks through AM or FM signals. It goes through radio signals at a speed that you set. So what you end up hearing is just a lot of little snippets of ads and talk shows and songs sometimes. So just little snippets. And so the idea is, whatever you are trying to communicate with, or maybe even something that you're not trying to communicate with, but is communicating with you, uses the random snippets of audio to string messages together for you. And it can be really, really, really strange and really direct. When we were doing, and this is in the Ray Wise episode, there were two moments where Rosa's plugged in and she says the same phrase 3 times in fairly quick succession. And what that means is that phrase came through different radio signals in different ways, got pieced together. And that's wild because these are just little snippets of radio. And it's, whether it's a phrase like get mad or racehorse or something like that, where it's like, oh, why it doesn't make as much sense that that would be in three different, it's not like some phrase that you hear like buy now or, what I mean? It's not like a common radio thing. But it also gets really, really responsive. And that's the thing that sort of gets very exciting for me when one person can only hear the spirit box and they can't hear the questions anyone else is asking, and those people can't hear the spirit box. It really relies on multiple people engaging in a very specific way. And so, in the pilot, there's a point where Rosa asks, like, what are you? Are you something that likes tricks? And I'm plugged in and I say something almost immediately afterwards, like parroting the word. There's a part where Rosa says some numbers. And then a few moments later, I say the numbers back. And I haven't heard Rosa because I'm just plugged into the box. The moments when it gets really responsive, the moment when it gets really communicative is, to me, some of the coolest, weirdest paranormal investigation stuff that's happened for me has been through the Estes method. One of my favorite ones that happens really consistently for me is I will ask, "Is anyone there, or is anyone trying to talk to us?" And almost immediately I'll get the response, "No," and that's very fun to me because it's a Laurel and Hardy gag, right? It's like, "Hey, is anyone home?" No, no one's home, because then who said it, right? And I think that there's something to me about the way that humor interacts with the paranormal that I think is also very, very important for me. I was telling you all before we started recording that I did stand-up comedy for over a decade. I was touring all over the country, and humor's always sort of been a really sort of focal point of my life. And there's moments too where, well, so I was having a conversation with someone, and they were asking me like, how do you avoid floating off into space? And by that they meant, you see people who are like, every license plate is an angel number, every bird is a message from something, like every single thing is a thing that it's not. And sometimes a bird is just a bird, and sometimes a license plate, most of the time actually, a license plate is just a string of numbers. And so it's, I think it's really important to not get too lost in the sauce anytime you're doing magic stuff, because it's tempting, right? It's tempting to feel like, and I think you see this with stuff like QAnon. I think you see this with different conspiracy theories where there is something very, it's almost like a drug to feel like there's a secret message out there and it's coming to me and I'm going to decode it and I understand the things that the regular people can't see. And I think for me, the most grounding thing has always been humor, because the phenomenon and magic always is at least a little bit funny. And so you see this moment in the first Estes that we do in the pilot episode where I'm feeling very bad because it's like really intense. I'm having a really sort of very scary experience with whatever it is that we're communicating with. And then towards the end of that, I mentioned, or the word the teeth comes through, and I laugh, and it like breaks me out of this like negative space. And that is because we had this moment earlier in the day when Tim had been talking about false teeth, and I was like, oh, I don't want to touch them. And he's like, I got him out for this other guy. And just as a joke, because this is just the way my brain works, I'm like, oh, he's like a real pervert then. And Tim was like, what? No, he's not a pervert. He's writing a book. He's a doctor. And I was like, that's okay. Very funny. A very funny interaction that I told our editor. I was like, please include that. Make sure that's in. Because that's very funny to me. But it's this moment where I'm in this thing and I'm feeling intense and overwhelmed and like bad, right? And then the teeth comes through and I laugh and it's like breaks me out of it. And that's really consistent for me, where the phenomenon is always funny and it's very playful. And I think that really has helped me sort of not get too, lost in the stream, or however you want to say it.
Do you feel like the phenomenon responds to different people's energy? Because you are a comedian, right. So humor is a grounding thing for you. So you experience it in a funny way, whereas somebody who maybe has a different energy would have a different experience. Do you feel like that's accurate?
I think that a lot of it sort of responds to what you're bringing to it. I think a lot of times magic will sort of meet you where you are. And so, I don't necessarily believe, I know there's like a Wiccan thing of like, whatever you put out is going to come back to you threefold or whatever. And maybe that's true. I'm not a Wiccan. I can't speak to that. But I do think that the energy that you engage with things is the energy that comes back to you. So I think that if someone is going out and they think that everything is going to be a demon or a negative attachment or a big scary thing. I think that the type of interaction that they're going to have is probably going to be scary. And I think there's something to the idea of tulpas and egregores and like
Mhm.
thought form and what we expect. But I just think I think that a lot of times magic is so malleable and so sort of it can really be any number of things, right? It can be, I mean, and this from a person who I think that a lot of times when we talk about UFOs, I think when we talk about cryptids, I think when we talk about ghosts, I'm not saying it's always the same thing, but I do think that there's a lot of crossover in these things, and I do think these things are very connected. I think, the fact that orbs appear when Bigfoot shows up, and orbs appear when UFOs show up, and orbs can appear when ghosts show up, has me thinking like, all right, well, what's the common, what are orbs then,
Mhm.
right? How does that participate in all of these things? And so I think if you go out looking for UFOs and you're going to find UFOs, I think you are more likely to encounter phenomenon that sort of feels UFO adjacent. And I think if you go out looking for Bigfoot, you're going to find something that feels more like a Bigfoot. And
Mhm.
I think that a lot of times, I think that we get what we put out. And again, not in like a punitive
Yeah.
threefold sort of way, but in like the world. But I also, and I think that that's true in the mundane as well. I think that that's sort of true just as we exist in life. We were just me and my partner were just at a furry convention, and we were checking out of our hotel. And the last night at the hotel, the toilet stopped working. Like the chain in the toilet, like the metal part it was attached to, like rusted through, and so the chain fell, and we couldn't attach it, and so the toilet was just not functional for the last night of the hotel. And that's nobody's fault. That's not the hotel's fault, but it is a less good hotel experience. And so in the morning I came and I talked to the manager. I was like, hey, I just want to say, first of all of the everyone working here, all the service, really, really sweet. Everyone's great. This is not an issue with anyone that we've worked here who's working here. Everyone here has been perfect. The toilet stopped working and someone came to try to fix it. They weren't able to fix it. Is there any way that we could get some sort of discount on the hotel based on not having a functioning toilet for part of it, which I think is a reasonable ask.
For sure.
And the hotel manager was was like so enthusiastic, like absolutely. And then he's like, people come here and they're angry all the time, and people just want to say that this is bad and demand all sorts of stuff. And I was just like, yeah, and I'm sure that sucks to deal with, but like if you're working at a hotel and someone comes at you with a bunch of anger for something that's not anyone's fault, like I don't want to help that person. I don't I don't want to give that person a thing. And I think there's just something about, yeah, I think in general you sort of you get back what you put in. And obviously that doesn't apply to, engagements with a lot of like fascist stuff and bigots and stuff like that. But I think
Yeah.
in general, across like the people who are at the very least neutral, I think when you approach someone with this idea that like we're all kind of on the same team here, we're all just trying we're all just trying to get by. And I think that when you approach someone with that mentality, I think you will have a better experience. And I think that's also true about ghosts and magic and spooky stuff as well.
Absolutely. As someone who has done telephone jobs, I can tell you that your attitude towards them is going to be
Oh
directly
yeah,
and proportionate to how much they're going to help you.
absolutely.
Because there's a difference between just functioning and doing your job and then actually trying to help a person. So
Absolutely.
I'm with you on that. That I was going to say a thing and it went away. So you guys deal in that first episode quite a bit
Yeah.
with tarot.
Yeah.
Is that something that you personally are into yourself?
I love tarot. It's it's a really important part of, even outside of just like the sort of the magical spiritual aspects of it. It's very grounding to me. Even it does feel, tarot is another one that's funny as hell to me, but just because like for me specifically, like I'll do it with my partner and they'll get a read that's like, oh, I really have this stuff to think about and I have all of these things to consider. And then I'll get one that's just extremely on the nose, like the most obvious, straightforward answer. Like, we were dealing with some issues with editing on the show, and all like every tarot read for that entire stretch was just like, you're experiencing delays. And it's like, yeah,
Thanks.
that's true. Thanks, tarot deck. And so that's very funny to me, like how straightforward it is. But I've really started, and I think, but that sort of experience to me really led me to start asking more specific questions, asking multiple questions, doing larger spreads. Yeah, I love tarot. I am by no means an expert. I'm always looking at the books. I'm always looking at the guidebooks to like, I'll try to run across a couple of different guidebook explanations because I like to sort of have a wider spread, the sort of thing like how can this make sense to me? I use a deck. This is the deck that I use in the show. It's called The Carnival at the End of the World. It's a really beautiful tarot deck. It's actually got I think 9 additional cards. The creators created their own, what they call the insubordinate arcana, which is sort of their own trope and archetype characters in there. So it's got even sort of more sort of cards you can pull than a traditional tarot deck, but it's a really beautiful one. There's a book. So they have the deck on its own, but they also have a guidebook that is really like a combination of prose and poetry. That's called Madame Lulu's Book of Fate, and it's sort of like, you can get them both at the same time. And so I reached out to the creators to be like, hey, I'm doing this show, would love to feature your deck in it. And they were like, absolutely. So that's like the deck that I feel the most connected to, and also the deck I bring out on the most like spooky encounters. So it feels very like charged for me. But yeah, I will do at least a couple of times a week. I will sort of bring questions and just sort of go to sort of use it as a grounding activity, as a grounding exercise. It's sort of like, what am I thinking about right now? What are some answers? What are some things I can lean into for the whole course of this rollout for the show and the crowd fund? There's a lot of like, are there specific people I should be reaching out to? Is there something I should be focusing my energy on? Had a very funny one in the hotel room where I asked 3 questions, and one of them was like, when can I rest? Like, when can I take a break? And the card I got was like, nimble feet, agile feet, keep on moving. And I was like, got it. Never. Cool. For sure. Thank you.
Never.
But yeah, no, I really love tarot. I really love, I think that there's something about, I think that we get so much from narrative. I think we get so much from narrative, and the idea of tarot as divination and sort of fortune telling through narrative, through the arc of the arc of the major arcana, through how the whole thing sort of represents cycles and motion and the wherever you are on the cycle. And I think this idea of like maybe you're getting something rough now, but like it's coming around, you just got to keep sort of going, right? It brings me peace, I think. So I love tarot a lot in my own personal life.
You're definitely wondering what that deck was. So thank you for sharing that, because we were like, that is cool.
The art is gorgeous. The art's gorgeous. The creators are very cool, and just I cannot recommend that deck highly enough.
It's awesome. I think we'll probably be seeing it in our home in the future.
Hell yeah. And I think, one of the things that I love about the paranormal space is that, you're going to get a lot of people who try to make it into hard science. And I think that it's not. I don't think that it is. Yeah. I think by definition it is not. I think if you could measure a ghost with, a tape measure, like a weight, it would be less fun than this idea that like, I don't know what this stuff is, and I got a lot of ideas, and I'm ready for any of them to be wrong, and I'm ready for all of them to be wrong, and to have to come up with some new ideas. That is spectacular to me. I love this idea of having a lot of evidence that does not conclusively prove a single thing, because it is by definition unprovable. And so a lot of opinions, a lot of takes, a lot of different ways. People like to investigate in different ways. People do magic in all sorts of different ways. And that is just like, that is so fun to me. At base, I want it to be fun. The world is so much more fun if it's bigger and it's more magical than maybe we get led to believe that it is. And I want it to be fun, and I want investigation to be fun. This is a very fun conversation. I love talking about this stuff. And I think, lots of points of views, lots of methodologies. That's great. I love that. It's a very sort of unique thing to the field, I think.
Absolutely.
I think for a lot of people, the whole thing of like wanting something to be scientifically provable, I think the reason why a lot of people feel this way, and it's something that I've been struggling with myself, is for a lot of people, especially in the US and in European like countries, the way of escaping from Christianity in general has been science. And so when that becomes part of your own personal narrative, you kind of want the thing to fit. And I've been working on myself, trying to tell myself that it's okay to have that third thing.
Yeah.
Because I think it is that third thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell our listeners how to watch your stuff.
Definitely. So we have our YouTube channel is youtube.com/@teamliminal. And they do this new thing. I complain about this as often as I can. I do not like that you got to put an @ sign in there now. That's very silly to me. But it is youtube.com/@teamliminal. Now, if you name anything or start one, you got to put an @ sign. Very silly. So yeah, youtube.com/@teamliminal. You can watch our full pilot episode now. On starting August 3rd, people will be able to watch the bonus episode we did with Ray Wise that's coming out. And we are also on TikTok. We're also on Instagram. We have a website that's liminaltv.com. All of these things are available at our link tree, which is linktr.ee. So linktree/liminaltv. That is also where people can find our crowdfund for episode 2. We want to, for the pilot, I sort of put everything that I had and I got everything together and we shot this thing and I'm so proud of it. And also I cannot afford to do that again. And so we are asking for people to support us on Seed and Spark. It's a really cool crowdfunding platform for media, for film and TV stuff specifically. We have a lot of really cool backer rewards. I mentioned our Beginner's Guide to Ghost Hunting zine. We're doing other stuff too, where we take Polaroids during some of our investigations, and people can get those that were used in the investigation. We'll sign them. We'll do filmed tarot reads on the set of wherever not the set, but the location of wherever we are. There's access. A lot of the interviews were so incredible, but only so much can make it into the episode, and so we're giving people access to the full interview if they want to sit down and hear everything that someone had to say. So there's a lot of really cool stuff on there. That's seedandspark.com/fund/liminal show. But all of these, if people just go to our linktree/liminal TV, everything's on there. And yeah, and even if there's people who are, it is a tough time right now. If people can't kick any money to the Seed and Spark, even just making an account and hitting follow on the campaign, that helps us out too, because it boosts us in their algorithm. It gets us in front of more people. So there's always, hitting subscribe on the YouTube channel. There's a lot of ways people can support and help the show get more traction, even without spending any money, which I appreciate, because I'm a person who does not like to spend money. So I totally get it. Do not always have money to spend, but there's a lot of non-financial ways people can support too. Following the campaign, sharing posts on social media, subscribing to the YouTube, all sorts of stuff. But yeah, linktree/liminal TV is the place where all of our links are. And yeah, easiest place to find us.
Awesome.
And that'll all be in the show notes for this episode as well. So if you want to click through, folks, it's super worthwhile.
Yes. And everybody go watch the pilot episode. It was amazing.
Thank you so much. And if you have a synchronicity yourself with it, leave it in the comments. Let me know. I definitely want to hear all of the ways that the sort of the spooky magic stuff we ran into reflects or is reflected by things in your own life.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. This was an awesome conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the space to talk about stuff that matters a lot to me, and it was just really nice talking to you both.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. If you have a strange story you want to share with us, email us at seekerandskeptic@gmail.com. We look forward to talking to you soon.